Welcome, everyone. I'm Scott Cassell, Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Product Stewardship Institute, or PSI. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar entitled New Department of Transportation Special Permit for Collected Pharmaceuticals. Today, our speaker will tell us why the special permit was necessary, what it covers, and the process to apply for the permit. So we're holding this webinar to help support drug take-back efforts in the United States. But first, I want to give you just a little bit background. For those of you that are not familiar with us, PSI is a national membership-based nonprofit. We're committed to reducing the health, safety, and environmental impacts of consumer products all across the life cycle with a strong focus on sustainable end-of-life management. We work on about 20 different product categories, including pharmaceuticals, and we have members from 47 states, hundreds of local governments. We also have about 110 partnerships from companies, organizations, universities, and non-U.S. governments, and 25% of our partners are in Canada. We're also on the board of the Global Product Stewardship Council, which works to share information internationally on these issues and working to bring the best possible programs here into the United States. Now, PSI has been working on pharmaceuticals stewardship for over 10 years, working with many of you on the call today. This is a joint effort, a large coalition, and we led a national coalition of agencies, companies, and organizations that resulted in changes to the Secure and Responsible Drug Disposal Act of 2010, as you see here on the timeline, and also to the subsequent Drug Enforcement Administration DEA regulations in 2014, both of which makes it more convenient for a consumer to drop off and responsibly dispose of their pharmaceuticals, particularly at retail pharmacies where we all know it's the most convenient place. So this made dropping off the leftover drugs very, very convenient for the consumers, which is a key factor in increasing collection through drug take-back programs. So today we'll focus on a new special permit that the DOT approved for shipping collected materials to comply with the DEA rule. So now I want to introduce today's webinar speaker. We're very pleased to have Andrew Eckenrode from the U.S. Department of Transportation. More specifically, Andrew works in the Approvals and Permits Division of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration's Office of Hazardous Materials Safety. Wow, that is a federal agency, and has been there for 2 years. He plays a very key role in administering this special permit that we'll be discussing today, and we're really extremely pleased that Andrew's able to join us. And I'd be remiss if I also did not mention Vivian Furman here at PSI, who is our expert on pharmaceuticals. She's been working hand in hand with many of you around the country to have safe disposal of pharmaceuticals and help to put this webinar together. So thank you, Vivian. But with that, before we get right into Andrew's presentation, I'm going to turn it over to another person that is critical to this webinar, and that's Susie Whalen from PSI, and she's going to give you some logistical information about how to participate. Susie?
Thanks, Scott, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're very glad to have you here. I'm just going to go over a few instructions that will help you ask questions throughout the webinar. So first, to ask technical questions, say you can't hear something or your screen doesn't look right, you should go down to the bottom right of your screen where it says Q&A. You should have a drop-down menu over there and selects all panelists to send the questions to. From there, Amanda Nicholson and Vivian Furman will be answering those questions and helping you make sure that you can hear everything and see everything perfectly. Now, if you have a content-related question, say you are confused about a point that Andrew makes during his presentation, we're going to make it easy for you, and you can use that same step-by-step process. Go down to the Q&A box on the bottom right, hit All Panelists, and ask your question there. Please be sure not to send a question to an individual panelist, Andrew or any of the PSI staff, or you may risk having your question go unnoticed. Thank you all for joining us today again, and I hope you enjoy the event.
Great, thanks, Susie. And just for information for those on the call, we got about 260 registrants for this call, and we're already up to 150 on the phone right now. So I'm sure more will be joining us, but it's a great turnout. And with that, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew. Andrew, you're up.
Hi, everybody. As he indicated, Andrew Eckenrode. I work for PHMSA, or the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. I appreciate you joining us today. We have certainly had our ear to the ground in terms of what's going on with the DEA Take Back program and how it relates to our regulations, and it certainly seems like there is continued interest on the regulated community side of this going forward. So we'll get right into it. Next slide, please. Okay, so today we're going to be going over, or I'm going to be going over three main sort of points to sort of how we came to be in the situation we are, which is issuing special permits for the DEA's Take Back program. Initially, we're sort of going to go over what the hazardous materials regulations are. Then we're going to touch on how our regulations and requirements have issues or conflicts with the DEA Take Back programs in the regulatory sense. And then we're going to go over special permits for the Take Back program and the idea of being issued a special permit for this activity. Next slide, please. So PHMSA is required by law to oversee the transportation of the commercial transportation of hazardous materials. So among other things, we have the authority to designate materials as hazardous, issue regulations governing that transportation, and then other sort of logistical and enforcement activities in terms of opening packages, issuing citations, as well as issuing emergency orders when an imminent hazard exists. Next slide, please. So essentially, if you were to boil down the hazardous materials regulations, you could do so to three words. First, what the regulations require is a shipper to classify the material. So we have 9 hazard classes, and some of those hazard classes have divisions within them, so they're even further subdivided. But when you have a material and you're looking to offer it for transportation and commerce, we first require you to classify that to determine whether it meets one of those 9 hazard classes. The second thing would be, if you do have a hazardous material, we want that to be contained during transportation. So this deals mainly with packaging. So I have a hazardous material. I'm trying to figure out how to ship it in accordance with the regulations. The regulations will assign me a specific type of packaging, and we'll even go further and assign that packaging specific performance-oriented criteria that it needs to meet. And lastly, communicate. When you have a hazardous material on the outside of the package that's containing it, we want that hazard communicated so that during transportation it is readily identified. So this is going to be marks, labels, placards, shipping papers, all things that to emergency responders as well as to those that are carrying the materials will give ready identification of what is inside a package. Next slide, please. So where the DEA regulations or requirements for the Take Back program start to initially conflict with the hazardous materials regulations is when it comes to classification. So my understanding of the DEA Take Back program is that you have pharmaceuticals, controlled substances within this inner liner, and the contents of that inner liner are not able to be analyzed and thus not able to be classified. So this is one of the pillars of what we do at PHMSA, is to have a material classified to ensure the safe transportation, and with the DEA program, that's unable to be done. As I kind of indicate in the second point, the nature of the DEA requirements prevent the examination of the liner contents. Therefore, the best you can get is an educated guess, which takes us to the next point of tentative classifications. Our regulations only allow for the tentative classification of a material when it's a sample and it's being shipped for testing purposes. So you look at that in the context of what you're doing with the DEA take-back program, and it just does not fit something that would be authorized to have a tentative classification. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into special permits. So we now have covered that the initial problem amongst some others, but probably the biggest and initial problem you come up against is the classification. So when you can't meet a particular regulatory requirement, the only route as a shipper would be to request a special permit. And so that's where we now get into the special permit territories, because the regulations simply do not allow for this activity to take place. So that's what we're going to get into next. Next slide, please. So what is a special permit? A special permit is essentially a document that's issued by the Associate Administrator of PHMSA and permits a person to perform a function that's not permitted by the regulations. Over time, we have issued thousands of special permits, and they range from air transportation of satellites, because the satellites contain a material that's forbidden by aircraft, non-DOT specification packaging, so a type of packaging that our regulations don't immediately authorize, use of electronic shipping papers, forbidden explosives by air. The list goes on and on. So you can imagine we certainly have a very wide scope of what we're dealing with here in terms of issuing these special permits. They certainly run from classification to containment to communication, and even beyond that to an extent. Next slide, please. So there's essentially two types of special permits that we issue. One we'll refer to as an offer special permit. This is where I am acting as a shipper or an offerer, so I'm actually offering a package to someone for transportation, but the package I want to offer them in some way, shape, or form is not meeting all the requirements of the hazardous materials regulations. I want to get an offer special permit. Now, a lot of times these offer special permits are going to have wide applicability to a person other than the person that originally requested it. So we do on occasion, oftentimes, in fact, open these up to party status, which means multiple parties will have authorization to operate under a single special permit. In this case, with an offer special permit, each entity that's packaging and offering needs to have party status. So if I'm working with another company and they say, hey, can you ship this? We have party status. If I'm doing that as a separate legal entity, I will need to have my own authorization. I can't operate under their authorization. The next type of special permit we'll talk about is the MMS special permit. MMS stands for Manufacture, Mark, and Sell. In the permit itself, we'll add a use at the end, but for our purposes right now, let's imagine this as just manufacture, mark, and sell. So what these authorize is the ability to manufacture a specific type of packaging, and it's only going to have a single holder. So a single holder of this special permit can manufacture a specific type of packaging that the special permit authorizes them to do, and then downstream users can utilize that packaging without being a party to that special permit. The special permit will have a special provision that gives them authorization to use the packaging without being in violation. The last point there, it may be used by any entity as long as it's complying with the terms within the permit. So as the user, you would certainly want to be aware of what the terms are, but you don't necessarily have to get your name on a piece of paper saying that you are the grantee of a special permit when you're solely using an MMS packaging. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the most recent special permit that we issued for the DEA Take Back program. It's DOT SP 20255. What this authorizes is the transportation of certain DEA-controlled substances for disposal. This special permit essentially waives the shipper from all the requirements in the hazardous materials regulations, apart from those that are specified within the special permit itself. In terms of what can be shipped under this special permit, it's strictly limited to hazardous materials authorized to be disposed of under 21 CFR Part 1317, Subpart B, which are the DEA Take-Back Program regulations. Next slide, please. So continuing on this topic, a very specific type of packaging, well, not all too specific, but you do have to use a packaging that is specified within the requirement, within the special permit itself. This packaging consists of an inner packaging, which is your liner, that meets both the DEA requirements as well as our requirements in the 49 CFR for regulated medical waste. The outer packaging is going to be what we define as a strong outer packaging and capable of meeting Packing Group 2 performance level criteria. And that capable word is certainly used with the intent of not saying it has to be UN specification packaging, just that it needs to be capable of meeting Packing Group 2 level UN specification packaging. And lastly, the completed packaging may not exceed 66 pounds gross weight. Next slide, please. So continuing on that, the collection of pharmaceuticals in accordance with this special permit is going to be limited to essentially people that are authorized by the DEA to perform those activities. We are going to be issuing this special permit and have issued this special permit to folks that are acting as the shipper under this special permit. So what that means is basically anyone who's preparing the package in accordance with what is specified in the special permit itself. So this isn't somebody just supplying the packaging. It's not the party that is actually transporting it. It's the person that is closing the liner and closing the rest of the package in a form to where it's compliant with the special permit 20255. Currently, this is only limited to motor vehicle, but we have had discussions with holders and other interested parties that are concerned or just have brought to our attention that other modes might be necessary for areas where highway transportation is not practical. Additionally, rail transportation might be the preferred mode of transportation for certain carriers. So these are ideas that have been brought to our attention, and we, as they come in, are going to certainly look and evaluate those proposals. Next slide, please. So I've gotten this question a lot, so and therefore I decided to include it in this presentation. Does this special permit apply to law enforcement? So you can look at this question in two ways. Does law enforcement need to have this special permit? And two, can law enforcement apply for this special permit? The answer to the latter of those two questions is yes, law enforcement can absolutely apply for this special permit. Do they need to? Well, the answer to that question is it depends. And what it depends on is whether the law enforcement agency is acting as both shipper and the carrier. If they're acting as both shipper and the carrier, then to my first point in this slide, our regulations are not applicable to local, state, and federal government employees that are transporting hazmat for government purposes. So if that's something where the law enforcement agencies fall within when they're conducting activities under the DEA Take-Back program, we're not necessarily going to be regulating those activities. What we are going to be regulating, however, is when law enforcement offers a collection kiosk that's packaged to a common carrier, say UPS, FedEx, whomever. At that point, in order for the carrier themselves not to be out of compliance, we would ask that the law enforcement agencies applied for this special permit in order to sort of, again, bridge that compliance gap that exists. Next slide, please. This is another question that we've gotten fairly often. Does each company location need their own authorization? So typically when I get asked this question, just in general, I say each location of a company does not need authorization. However, each separate legal entity that wishes to perform the functions under that special permit will need authorization. So if you're simply a single legal entity and have multiple locations, you only need one application to be submitted and one authorization to be approved and then distributed to the company from us. However, even if you have the same company name, but you're separate legal entities, wholly owned subsidiaries, we will, at that point, need you to have your own separate authorization. And this authorization is valid in all states. It's just not limited to the state that the company resides in. Next slide, please. How does a company apply to become party to this special permit? In the regulations, 49 CFR 107.107, we are going to have some provisions for what's to be included in the application. Additionally, on our website, we have a checklist and a sample party status application that helps facilitating the application process. And once you have generated that application, we would have you submit it to special permit at dot.gov. Now, I believe if I can have the sample party status application put up real quick. So, and if you can scroll down just a little bit, this is, or do I have control of that? Okay, sorry about that. So, as you can see here, we're basically requesting some simple company information on a standard sort of layout that if you can generate a document similar to this, it's really all you need to do to apply for party status. We're looking for your company name, address, a contact person, email, telephone, the locations where it's used, so on and so forth. But I guess my main point for showing this is it's not necessarily all that complex to fill this out. Additionally, there's no cost associated with this. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so is this special permit the only avenue for compliance? The answer to that is no. In addition to special permit 20255, we also have issued special permit 16592. This is essentially for parties that are acting as both shippers and carriers, so the scope is a little bit more limited than 20255, but it does exist. However, we don't want to dissuade anyone from proposing a new idea and requesting a new special permit. The special permits that exist right now are certainly not the end-all, be-all, but right now they're the only things that have been applied for, essentially. So with that said, I would say if somebody has a creative solution of how we can bridge the gap between our regulations and DEA's regulations and be within the framework we're authorized to be in, please either reach out to us, submit an application for it, but we're certainly looking for alternative solutions if they're brought up. Next slide, please. All right, so I guess now we're ready for questions. I appreciate you sitting in and listening to me today, and I'll be here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate that and leaving plenty of time for those questions here. I just want to let you know we've got 175 folks on the line, so there's a lot of interest in the regs, and I want to encourage that those that are on the line to be using your Q&A box at the bottom right, as discussed earlier, to send in your questions, and then I'll read them here, and Andrew will be able to answer them. So we do have a couple of those, and I will start with Bob Spurgeon. Bob said, so a hauler must be a DEA registrant to participate, his question, or does a hauler need to be a DEA registrant to participate? Many medical waste haulers provide non-hazardous and DEA waste services for take-back events.
All right, thank you for that question. Let me real quick just get in my our system reboots here every week or so at different times, but it seems like I maybe get kicked off the system, but I should still be fine being connected by phone. I'm not sure I need the computer anymore, so I just wanted to let the PSI folks know just in case they saw the computer drop off, but I apologize for that. It's an inconvenient time for that, but I think we'll be okay. And now to address the question, in terms of a person that is actually performing the function of transporting these materials, right now we would not necessarily require you if the shipper was utilizing special permit 20255, who they, yes, are have certain requirements at to meet with the DEA. They need to certainly fulfill those. But you as the carrier, we're not looking for you to be a registrant with the DEA. Essentially, that language was in there to ensure that somebody who is offering this for transportation was not a party that was not in compliance with the DEA regulations. But a carrier, so long as the offerer has a special permit, is certainly able to transport the material, at least as far as PHMSA is concerned, without being registered with the DEA. That's more a DEA thing. If DEA requires it, then there's some caveats in our special permit that would require you to also have it. But if DEA doesn't require the carrier to be registered, this special permit would not then require the carrier to be registered.
Great, thank you, Andrew. And if there's any follow-up questions or comments, please send them back in the Q&A box. I see some are using the chat box, which is not preferable. That's above the Q&A. There's a Q&A box at the bottom right. It's just easier if they're all into the same box there for us to get them. But please keep those questions coming. So I have another one here from Leonard Huffman. Leonard asks, so he says that our meds are collected at police stations, and we have a police escort when we deliver to disposal site. Do we need a permit?
So now, if you are a commercial carrier and not a government employee for transporting for government purposes, you would need to have some type of authorization that bridges that gap. And this goes back to what I was saying towards the end of my slides, where at this point it would be beneficial for the law enforcement agencies to have party status, so you as the carrier could then transport it without being in violation of our regulations. Unfortunately, the addition of having a police escort doesn't necessarily invoke a further exception in our regulations. When you're dealing with government entities, we still view contractors as regulated entities, even if they're doing things on behalf of the government. So we would really be looking at that activity as regulated, and therefore a special permit would be needed up until the point where the government employees are using government vehicles to transport that material.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Ed Gottlieb. He asks, are these permits issued to the shipper or to the person sealing the box?
So for our purposes, we have this term that we define as pre-transportation functions. And so a number of entities can perform pre-transportation functions for a single shipment. So there can always be multiple shippers. Now, if you are sealing an inner liner in this package, that is a pre-transportation function. If a separate entity is then coming and closing the package making sure it's in accordance with the instructions that they were provided. That would also be considered a pre-transportation function. So a shipper, by our definition, would be anybody that's performing a pre-transportation function. So, you know, your question, the answer that I would have for you is, it could be both. If the person sealing the package is different than the person that's completing the package, then you would have two shippers. We're not really defining that term by, any one person that's actually giving it to the carrier. We're really defining it by what did one person contribute to the completion of this package, whether that be filling it, whether that be, again, closing an inner liner or closing the outer package itself.
Okay. Thank you. We have one from Diane Loftus, and Diane asks, how long is a permit valid for?
So right now, DOTSP 20255 was requested under our emergency processing guidelines, and so it's currently under, issued as an emergency. And for emergencies, we like to keep it to 6 months. However, we would anticipate somebody would come and apply to modify that from emergency to routine, and then at that point, your party status application would be issued for a 2-year period, and then, or your party status authorization would be initially issued for a 2-year period, and then each subsequent renewal would be for a 4-year period. But right now, since it's still technically under emergency status, it will be issued in 6-month intervals.
Okay. Here's another question from Jeannie Jaramillo. What are the training requirements?
So for this special permit specifically, we waive the HMR 171 through parts 171 through 180, which are otherwise known as the hazardous materials regulations. We waive all of those, and that would include the training requirements that we have in our regulations. However, anybody that is performing functions under the special permit is going to need to be trained in accordance with the special permit. And so, they're going to have to review the special permit and make sure that they can perform functions in accordance with it, and that there's no, apologize about that, and there's no gaps between what they're offering for transportation and what the special permit requires.
Okay. Let me ask the most frequently asked question that we get on all webinars, which is, can we get an emailed copy of the presentation? The answer is yes. It's available within 24 hours after this presentation. It will be up on our website. I'll mention this again at the end. Also will be available with the voice, the recording as well. Okay, let me ask a question from Kevin Hogan. How do you determine if a package meets the PG2 performance standard, if not a spec package?
That's definitely a good question. And determining whether a package is capable of meeting those PG2 requirements would be incredibly difficult unless there was some initial testing done on the package in comparison to what the performance criteria for a PG2 package would be. So to determine that, yeah, I would imagine there's going to be some testing involved, but the certification process would not be that of a UN packaging. So if a company has the ability to do the tests, they can certainly perform them and determine whether it's equivalent to a PG2, or if they're getting packages from a manufacturer and that manufacturer can provide that data. Those would certainly be routes where you could confirm that it meets the or it's capable of meeting the PG2 packaging requirements. But it is a good question that, you know, can I get this package and just assume, or do I actually have to do testing? And if I'm actually having to do testing, then why don't I get UN specification packaging? Well, the capability requirement was put in there because when this was undergoing technical evaluation, we really felt that when you're having a package that potentially contains hazardous materials and you're not really aware of exactly which hazardous materials those are, the packaging needs to have some level of integrity that we can recognize and quantify to a degree. So that's why we included the capability requirement into the special permit, rather than just saying strong outer packaging, or rather than just saying it must be UN spec packaging, because we understand that the process of getting a package UN certified can be a little bit more onerous than just determining the capability of it meeting the PG2 specification.
I got a couple of questions around the definition of shipper and carrier, and I'm wondering if you could explain the difference and define each.
Absolutely. So a shipper we define as a person that's performing one or more pre-transportation functions. So I'm going to have to define pre-transportation function before I can go on to shipper. And this won't be all-encompassing, but I'm going to give you an idea, because in our regulations we define it using 14 different actions, and we even say then that it's not all-inclusive. But if you are classifying a material, if you are filling a package, if you're closing a package, if you're determining whether a package is suitable for use for a specific material, if you're applying labels, if you're applying marks, if you're selecting placards, those are all things that we define as pre-transportation functions, and thus a shipper is a person performing one or more pre-transportation functions. A carrier, on the other hand, is essentially the person that's transporting the material. And a shipper and a carrier can both be the same company, it can be the same person, or, you know, I think we generally think of it in terms of two separate entities. So the carrier would be the person coming to pick up your package to transport it from point A to point B.
Okay, great. Thank you. We got a whole bunch of other training questions, but I think we've answered them. Let's see if we've got some follow-ups at the end here. But here's one about shipping and carrying. So this is from Danielle Meyer. If the DEA is handling all of the shipping and carrying of collected pharmaceuticals during the take-back, does each participating entity need to apply for the permit? Don't we all fall under the DEA permit?
So, and I guess that questions, let me make sure I'm understanding it first. So the DEA, it's my understanding, is not actually physically collecting the materials and transporting the materials. It's actually private entities that are doing that. So our regulations don't necessarily differentiate whether someone is operating under the DEA take-back program or not. We're just looking at the simple fact that you're a private company, i.e. not a government entity or not a private individual, and you're transporting hazardous materials from point A to point B, or you're offering hazardous materials from point A to point B. So the fact that entities are registered with the DEA and abiding by the DEA's regulations is not necessarily something that becomes too much of a relevant factor when determining the applicability of our regulations. Again, we're simply looking for people that are offering hazmat for transportation, people that are actually transporting it, who A, aren't private individuals, and B, aren't government entities. So I hope that answered the question. I wasn't 100% sure on the relationship that was trying to be conveyed with the DEA collecting and carrying, but I certainly will be available for further clarification.
Yeah, I think you answered that question as to what I think the person asking the question was trying to get at. Let's get to Jeff Roberts' question here. Jeff asked, do carriers need to apply for DOT SP 20255 if they are simply transporting the packaged liners?
If they are simply transporting the packaged liners, then the answer would be no. They do not need to apply for the special permit. However, the entity that is offering them the liners for transportation would need to have party status to that special permit in order for that shipment to be in compliance.
Okay. Jeannie Jaramillo asks, if we have one entity, call it pharmacy chain ABC, if that one entity has 200 boxes across the U.S., is it required to have a person at each site to meet the training requirements?
Yes, so if you have a box at 20 different sites for one company, and you have 20 different people, one at each of those sites that's preparing shipments in accordance with the special permit, then yes, each one of those individuals would need to have training. Again, that requirement is going to align with who's actually performing the activities. And if you have 20 different people doing that at 20 different sites, then each of them would need to be trained in accordance with the special permit.
Okay. Here's one from Leo Rodis. He asked, many of the pharmacies that will be acting as collection sites are small community pharmacies for whom applying for a permit may be a deterrent for doing collection. Has DOT considered the option of reaching an agreement or MOU with the DEA so that the online registration as a collector could also serve as an application for the special permit? It appears that the information required for DEA registration matches that of the DOT special permit.
That's definitely a good question. And while we are collecting similar information, we also are required to run fitness on applicants that apply for special permits. And what fitness is, in short, is essentially using data that we have to determine that an applicant hasn't had too many incidents or citations of in one form or another. And so that's certainly an important part and something that differentiates between what DEA is doing and what we're doing with our application process. But to sort of answer your question in a nutshell, I do not believe there has been consideration in terms of making an MOU or memorandum of understanding between us and the DEA to sort of unify the application process to have one also meet the other. At this point, we would still need a separate application, and going forward for the foreseeable future, we would still, if something's going under a special permit for this take-back program, we would still be looking for someone to apply with us in order to be in compliance.
If there was an efficiency in that and it would remove some barriers to small pharmacies for collecting, would that be something that could be entertained and worked out through the agencies?
I certainly think a proposal such as that would merit being listened to. That would by us and entertained. I'm probably not the person that could speak directly to sort of that process and where to go next, but I certainly think something for the sake of efficiency in making this program run more smoothly is certainly worth looking into. I just am not sure I'm the right one to speak on that.
Sure. And perhaps that's something we can follow up on here. If there's a process by which, another entity would like to make a proposal for, the greater good, if you will, what is the process for doing that? So why don't we follow up with that after the session? Here's one from Mark Hauser. Does the federal permit supersede any state transporter authorization requirements for hazardous or regulated medical waste?
So, so our regulations, we don't allow, I guess with, the term is escaping me right now, but states can have more strict requirements than we can have, but they can't necessarily have requirements that are going to interfere with someone's ability to comply with our regulations. The word actually I was looking for is preemption. So the question regarding does this supersede state requirements, well, we're not necessarily saying you don't have to, if you get party status to this permit, we're not saying that you don't have to comply with state requirements. We're saying that you need to comply. If you're a party to this and you're using this permit, you need to comply with it. But if the state's asking you to do additional things, we're not going to alleviate or accept you from those requirements. So I would say both would be applicable, and under the idea of preemption, the state wouldn't have a requirement imposed that hinders your ability to meet our requirements. Without a without a specific example, it's a little bit difficult to really get into detail of how the two would interact. But from the general premise of preemption, I don't think ours would supersede theirs, and at the same time, I don't necessarily think there would be any alleviation of requirements either way.
Okay, Barry Fernandez asked this question. If the stronger outer packaging is required to be packaging group 2 capable, how does one demonstrate that capability? As a follow-up, why not just require PG2 containers? There are plenty on the market that are PG2 certified with weight limits of 66 pounds.
And that's a good question. I think we kind of went over that earlier, but we didn't necessarily want to require that an entity go through the full certification of a packaging. We understand that can be a bit more onerous than just determining whether something is capable of meeting PG2, because you can sort of use data from packaging supplier. If they have it, it certainly gives somebody the ability and flexibility to get their package tested without having to go through the additional steps of getting it UN certified. As to why we chose to say capable rather than just having it be strong outer packaging, again, that's because during the technical evaluation, we felt that we had to have some type of standard to tie this package to, since we have the unusual scenario of not knowing what's in the package, and if there was an incident, we wouldn't want the integrity of the packaging to come into question. We certainly wanted to have that be a known in an activity that has quite a few unknowns.
Judy Belleville wants to take another run at the shipper and carrier question here with maybe more of a specific example. So she's asking, if a hauler comes to a collection event, packages the collected pharmaceuticals and transports them to a destination facility, who is the offerer, shipper, and carrier in this case?
Scott, can you repeat that question one more time?
Sure. If a hauler comes to a collection event, packages the pharmaceuticals, transports them to a destination facility, who is the offerer, shipper, and carrier in this case?
Sure. So let me first start off by saying, and I apologize for not making this clear earlier, offerer and shipper are used interchangeably in our regulations, and so sometimes without knowing so, we use them interchangeably when we're discussing them. So let's look at it in terms of shipper and carrier, because offer is the exact same thing as shipper. So in this case, the hauler would be acting as both shipper and carrier, presuming they were closing up the liner, closing the package, and then transporting it to its final destination. If the location that had this kiosk or this collection bin, if an employee of that location sealed that inner liner prior to the hauler coming in and finishing up the packaging of those liners, then you would have two shippers. You would have the hauler as well as the employee at the collection site. But to go back to your example, if we're just assuming the hauler is performing all activities, then the hauler would be acting as both shipper and carrier.
Okay. Here's a comment from Celine Hoboy, which you might want to add to. So Celine says, it might be helpful to explain that DOT was trying to issue this, this ruling here, the permit, so that the pharmacy or generating facility would not have to apply for the special permit. It just might help clarify that each individual location is not required, and then she says to maybe say a specific, retailer. So I'm wondering if you wanted to embellish on that a little bit, Andrew.
Yeah, so and I guess there's quite a little bit of history in when we were addressing the first application that we got in for this from Stericycle, and the second one that we received also from Stericycle. Initially, without maybe having the best knowledge of how reverse distributors and pharmacies and others were preparing to implement this take-back program, we were looking at how to reduce the number of entities that would need to request this. So we were looking at the grantees of the special permit acting as both shipper and the carrier, and thus not having it so pharmacies would need to have their own status. That was the initial permit that we issued. Then when we got the request that was subsequently assigned 20255, that one, again, we were certainly not looking at pharmacies directly being the applicants, but we were kind of under the assumption that other entities who were more involved, such as reverse distributors, would be, or waste haulers, would be coming to the facility, preparing the collection bin for transportation, and then either transporting it themselves or offering it to a common carrier. So we didn't necessarily have it envisioned that, mom and pop pharmacies all across the U.S., in addition to chain pharmacies, every single site that has this would need to come in and apply, because that's certainly a paperwork burden that we don't want to put on ourselves, and it seems a little bit excessive when you're dealing with all these entities coming in for party status. So that wasn't the initial intent, but as we started to understand more, and a lot of this understanding came after Special Permit 20255 was issued, we came to understand more that reverse distributors were not playing the same role that we thought they would be, and this is just our lack of experience with that field. Maybe some talking past each other when we were discussing with reverse distributors. We just didn't anticipate or know how they were going to be involved and how others were going to be involved. So I guess to go back to Celine's initial point, we didn't necessarily try to issue something where every pharmacy would need to come in for party status. However, we did want to issue it to people that were performing all the shipper functions, It's just there was a little bit of a misunderstanding in who actually would be performing those functions through some of the conversations that we had leading up to the issuance of that special permit.
Okay. Let me just ask you, Andrew, we've got about 5 minutes left here. We've got a bunch of other questions. Would you be available for, say, an extra 15 minutes if folks wanted to stay on, for a little bit longer to hear some answers to some of the other questions?
Yeah, I think so, provided that somebody doesn't come to the conference room and kick us out because it's
right.
their
Fair
reservation.
Enough.
But I think we should be good.
All right, fair enough. You'll just give us the signal, and we'll bring it in for a close here. But since we have still 150 people on the line, over 170 at one point here, and there's still a few more questions we'd like to get to, I'd like to do that. So thank you. So here's a question from Bill Yemen. It's kind of related. That's why I want to ask it in this order. He says, I understand that Stericycle was issued the original special permit. If their workers perform all the pre-transportation requirements at a pharmacy location, would there still be hazmat training requirements for the pharmacy location staff?
No, if the hauler is coming and performing all pre-transportation functions, and thus presumably would be the grantee or the party that has status to the special permit, then they would need to have special permit training, but the pharmacy employees themselves, since they're essentially just acting as a collection facility at that point, they would not need special permit training because they're not performing any functions under the special permit.
Okay. Here's one from Khalid P. Egloff. Is a special permit necessary for a government-operated household hazardous waste facility where unwanted meds are collected by a hazmat company with police presence, where police are packaging, and police are driving to the incinerator for a witness burn?
So, just because I guess it would be difficult to ask follow-up questions to get clarification, I'll try to run through the answer to this question in two potential scenarios. So we have law enforcement officers that are at, I believe what he's saying is a private entity's collection location. The police officers are there, they package, and then they're driving to the incinerator. Assuming that the law enforcement officers or agency is driving the actual hazardous materials to the incinerator, that would not need a special permit because that is not something that is subject to the hazardous materials regulations. However, if at this facility the law enforcement officers are preparing the package for shipment, giving it to a private carrier, and then escorting it to incineration, then a special permit would be required because now you're back in commerce by having that prior carrier take it for incineration.
Okay, thank you. We did get a couple of other questions along that lines. I think you've answered it here. We'll see if there's any follow-ups from there. Bill Yemen says pharmacies that have other pharmaceuticals that they ship back to reverse distributors. Have any special permits been issued by FAMSA for those?
Can you repeat that question?
Bill says that pharmacies they have other pharmaceuticals that ship back. If they're outdated meds or so, they're shipped back to reverse distributors. Have any special permits been issued by your agency for that kind of an arrangement?
Gotcha. So it sounds like that is separate from the take-back program.
Yes.
And I'm not aware of any special permits for that, and I think this is why. The pharmacists say they have an expired, some expired drugs that they meet the definition of a hazardous material. The pharmacist, prior to shipping that out, we'll know what he's actually trying to ship, and thus giving him or her the ability to classify the material prior to shipping it. So the reason why I don't think I can pop off any special permits from the top of my head is, one, we probably, if we do have any, we probably don't have that many, and two, most people are probably just shipping that in accordance with the regulations because they're able to classify it, because there's no prohibition on them trying to identify what they're preparing to ship out.
Dan King asked this question. Can you tell us which companies now hold this special permit? You mentioned Stericycle. Do any other, Sharps Compliance Inc. or Clean Harbors or others, do they hold this special permit as well?
There are others that have come in, and some have been granted, some are still pending for one reason or another. And not that that would be information that we would hold close to the vest, so to speak, but off the top of my head, I am just not exactly sure which companies that have been granted. Actually, my colleague just handed me what's up on our website right now, which might be all-inclusive, but it looks like we have Stericycle Specialty Waste Solutions, Midwest Environmental Transport, Inc., Assured Waste Solutions, County of Wake, and I know we have other applications in, and I believe some of them have even been approved. I believe I did a couple for Vivian at PSI, and I know one of those got through, but it's just not being reflected on the website. So unfortunately, I don't have an all-inclusive list. It's not something that trying to not give out, but I just don't have it off the top of my head.
So maybe that's something we can follow up on, and if you have a link so people can get the real time there, that would be very helpful. Here's another thing you might be able to refer us to. This is Mark Gibbons. He says, will you be providing a glossary of terms for things like HMR or PG2 or other things like that? Is there a place you have it on your website you can direct us to and we can send it out to the group?
The best place for the terminology that I'm using probably to reference would be in the regulations, which we can provide a link to, certainly, and it'll go through those terms plus some others that I've used today that are also used in the permit, and that's really probably the best glossary that I could think of is our actual regulatory section that deals with definitions. So we can certainly provide access to that.
Okay. Donna Moren says, without a special package or permit, I guess, would the shipping be the same with just the DOT SP written on the universal waste label?
Can you repeat that once more?
Without a special package, would the shipping be the same with just the DOT SP written on the universal waste label? I'm not fully sure about that question, but maybe you do. If not, we can ask Donna to explain a little bit more in a subsequent question. Doesn't ring a bell?
Yeah, I was just conferring with my colleagues. We would probably want to have some clarification. So I guess in what I would want clarification. So when we're talking about special package under the special permit, the special permit's not going to require the SP to be marked on the package or any type of manifest that's being used. We've waived those requirements. So I guess I would want some clarification on the reference to the special package and where that plays into utilizing the special permit.
Okay. We'll ask Donna for that. Hopefully she's still on and she can send that to us. So Ryan asks, Ryan Gastecki, will a reverse distributor need to be party to this permit as the carrier for take-back medicines from retail pharmacy or hospital clinic pharmacy?
So my understanding of what the reverse distributor does when they are acting as the carrier from I guess where they're vaulting this to the location for destruction, is that they open the package, verify the liner that's in there, and then reclose the package. And based on them performing this function, my answer would be yes, a special permit or party status to the special permit would be necessary, because you are, again, performing the shipper function of closing a package. Even as minor as it may be, you're responsible for the containment of hazardous materials, so thus you're the shipper and would need party status. If someone it doesn't really touch the package in terms of opening it up or reclosing it, they're only transporting it, those entities do not need party status. But again, my understanding of what a reverse distributor does when they're verifying the tracking number, that's sort of what's going to bring them in to being considered both a carrier as well as a shipper.
Okay, and here's another question about definition of shipper. So is a consumer who purchases an envelope, fills the envelope with meds, and mails the envelope in, is that person a shipper?
Just as our regulations are not applicable to government employees transporting for government purposes, we also are not going to regulate a private individual. And while depending upon which type of carrier, whether it's Postal Service, who we don't regulate, takes it, or whether it's FedEx, whom we do, that's where the regulation ultimately comes in, is once you have a commercial entity involved in the transportation. But to directly answer your question, no, we would not regulate the private individual.
Right, okay. All right, I'm going to ask just a couple more. It looks like we're getting down to it here. And let's see, Charlotte Smith, I know I'm looking for the question that she had before. I think it was just here we go. So Charlotte Smith says, perhaps it would be helpful to differentiate between the DEA take-back days versus the in-store collection kiosks. So I think that was relating to some of the confusion a little bit before on this, and so maybe you can discuss that how the take-back days work and how the in-store collection and which one needs a special permit and which one doesn't.
Well, I might need a little bit of clarification on what a DEA take-back day versus a collection bin is. I guess from our perspective, we're looking at a prepared package being offered into the transportation stream. So if the bin is, and I think this is just maybe I'm going to have a little bit of a tough time understanding the terminology that's being used.
So let me ask Vivian. I know I could probably take a run at it here, but the take-back, the DEA take-back days are coordinated by DEA, and really and it's one day, and it's there's various how it's funded. They're just different than the in-store collections, which are ongoing. But Vivian, can you put this in the regulatory terms for me here, and to help to give some greater clarity to the question?
Sure, Scott. Your description was accurate, but I think the pertinent question here is whether, regardless of whether the drugs are being collected in a permanent receptacle or in a take-back event situation, whether those are transported by a government official or a commercial carrier, a common carrier. And so I think, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, whether it's a take-back day or a permanent collection receptacle doesn't matter as much as what happens to the boxes or the liners in the end, whether they're being transported or shipped commercially.
Yes, your understanding is correct. We're not going to necessarily look at those as a take-back day versus the on-site collection. We're not going to look at those as two separate situations when in fact, ultimately, what's going to happen is a package containing or potentially containing hazardous materials is going to be offered for transportation in commerce. So if during the take-back day, transportation is done by a private entity, that's something that we are still going to regulate, just as we would when a private entity is taking a collection kiosk from, say, a pharmacy. I'm not sure exactly what roles the DEA plays in these. If they're actually performing some transportation, then the answer might be a little bit different. If they are performing the transportation functions, then we're not looking at something that's in commerce. But again, if we're dealing with a private entity transporting, then we're back in commerce, and it's a regulated action.
All right, great. Just one more question here from, this is now a question as opposed to a comment from Charlotte, and then we're going to bring us in for a close here. Charlotte asked, does the carrier need to obtain a copy of the shipper's special permit to ensure compliance?
No, they don't necessarily need to ask for a copy of the special permit to verify that they are, in fact, party to the special permit. That's not necessarily a requirement that we're imposing on the carrier. Of course, it's certainly good practice to ensure the person that you're taking it from, if they're deviating from the regulations, it has some type of authorization to make that deviation. But as this permit is written, there's no requirement for the carrier to, one, ask for that special permit, and I don't believe we require that the carrier has a copy in their vehicle either.
Great. Okay. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Andrew, for all the Q&A. Hopefully, it didn't seem like a very fast paddleball back and forth here, but you did a great job for answering so many questions that came in, and so I want to thank you very much for being part of the call. I also want to thank all of those who are on the call for your questions here, very, very targeted and very, very helpful for all of us. So you should be aware, as you can see here on the slides, all of our webinars and web conferences are taped, including this one, so you can have access to them if you miss any or if you want to listen again. So the recording of today's web conference will be posted within 24 hours on our website, and you should already have received a direct link to the web page, and you'll receive it again via email at the close of today's webinar. So to access recordings of other webinars, and we've held hundreds of these webinars before, not all on this topic, but quite a few on pharmaceuticals. So to access other webinars, you can go to productstewardship.us, click on Events, and then Webinars, and you can see that on the screen here. So as soon as the webinar ends, you'll see a webinar evaluation form that comes up. So we'd really appreciate if you could just take a moment to let us know your feedback. Your opinion does matter to us, and this survey ensures that we continue to provide you with the kind of excellent content that you had here for the webinars and web conferences. If you accidentally close out of it, you can receive a link to the evaluation and a follow-up email as well that we'll be sending. So with that, we also have for PSI here memberships and partnerships. This one we did for free for here because we know the community is so interested, but we are a nonprofit, and we could really use support financially from those that are not members or partners. We would encourage you to look into that. There's much more value for that than I can talk about here, but we would greatly appreciate it, and it does allow us to do these kind of webinars for all of you. So with that, you can see the follow-up information. The one you really want to look at here, besides Andrew's, is Vivian Foreman's. And Vivian, again, I want to thank you, Vivian, for all the work you've done in preparing Andrew and contacting Andrew and working for this. this webinar to put it together, and I want to thank Susie Whalen and the PSI crew here for putting on the webinar and dealing with all the logistics to get people on. So thanks very much, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. And Andrew, once again, thank you.
Thank you.
And Scott, this is Vivian. I just want everyone to know that we will also be compiling unanswered questions and sending out the answers once Andrew's had a crack at those. So thanks very much.
I think there might have been just a couple, not too many here. I think we got through almost all of them, so that's great. And so thanks very much, Vivian. Yeah. Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.